Penrose.
Thank you, Mr. Streeter. And I should start by saying that I sympathise with, instinctively, an awful lot of the fears and analysis of the honourable gentleman from Birmingham, Selly Oak. I think that, as a former Constitution Minister myself, one of the things which persuaded me and inspired me to team up on 6 amendments, that is all, not quite the same number as I've been in total tabled by my right honourable learned friend from Beaconsfield, but I have teamed up with him on 6 and I'm the number 2 signatory on them, was simply because I was equally concerned that under the guise of taking back control we were going to fail to do that and that Parliament would be unintentionally but nonetheless effectively end run if we weren't careful. So I have been focusing on 2 areas, Mr. Streeter. Those have been the sifting committee and also the question of the scope of the ministerial powers to introduce statutory instruments under Clause 7, but also under Clauses 8 and 9, which are obviously linked and we are sort of discussing and then voting on today and tomorrow. And it just strikes me that I think the sifting committee issue, for me at least, and I think for my right honourable learned friend from Beaconsfield, has been largely put to bed by the excellent and cross-party work of the Procedure Committee. I'd like to pay tribute to them. It may not be to everybody's taste, but I think that because it is cross-party, and because it has been carefully debated and thought through, and it is clearly as well a significant step in the right direction, that I am certainly willing to back this, and I think that both I and my right honourable learned friend from Beaconsfield, who's in fact put his name to the Procedure Committee's amendment, are therefore not minded to press our version, which is based, as I think a couple of people have observed, on the proposals from the Hansard Society. We are very happy not to press that and to instead support the proposals from the Procedure Committee as well. I would incidentally just gently and respectfully disagree with the honourable gentleman from Birmingham, Selly Oak, because I think that the government's behaviour over the sifting committee amendments does rather show that they have given ground. They have accepted some amendments. He's saying it's a very small amendment. I think it could be rather larger than perhaps he's giving it credit for. And the reason why is because there are 2 big problems which we would otherwise have faced. One was that it is impossible for the government to predict in advance at this stage precisely what SIs are going to be introduced. We all know there's going to be a very large number of them, and we can probably guess what 95% of them are going to be, but there will be 5% at least which we can't guess simply because we don't know what's going to be in the final agreements, and there will obviously be other things that will be consequential on that which we will discover much nearer the day. And therefore, having a sifting committee that says we can therefore be flexible and we can take a proper balanced judgment by parliamentarians about what is important and needs the higher level of scrutiny, I think is no small thing. And it also, secondarily but equally importantly, allows us to move at pace, because if we're going to have 800 to 1,000 of these statutory instruments, and we are all, I think, now saying that we want this to happen in time, we accept it's going to happen, and there seems to be a welcome acceptance on all sides of the House, no matter whether or not we have voted for Remain or for Leave in the referendum itself, that this has to happen, and we have to have a statute book that works on the day after we leave, that therefore we need to be able to get through this at pace, and the sifting committee is an essential method of allowing us to maintain that pace while still varying the level of scrutiny which is required. And I'll happily give way to the chairman of the committee.
I thank my honourable friend for his kind words about the excellent work of the Procedure Committee. Does he accept that the great success of this House, one of our great achievements, has been the work of select committees and the cross-party consensus that they can find and build?
I would absolutely accept that. And I think that also one of the other important things about both the sifting committee and, I'm going to go on to talk about scope in a minute, will be that there are other bits of primary Brexit-related legislation which are starting their journey through this House, many of which have large numbers of SIs and potentially of primary legislative amending statutory instruments in them as well. And what we agree for this particular Act may very well be an important template for for the way that we treat those same powers or very similar powers in other subsequent pieces of legislation. So we're doing important work here, and it is crucial that we do it. I would also encourage him, if he wants to take it a little further in due course, to broaden out his committee's approach to look more broadly at the SI scrutiny powers after this is done. I think many of us here would encourage him to do that, but I think that is too wide for this bill right now. I would happily give way to my...
Very grateful to my honourable friend. Before he moves off the question of the sifting, would he agree with me that it represents substantial progress that we've also heard from the dispatch box today, that the recommendations made by the committee will be respected by the government in its conduct of the House?
Absolutely, I would accept that point, and those commitments I think will be also important. It obviously helps to have, we will need to make sure that this all gets baked properly into standing orders and that the relevant votes there are passed correctly, but those commitments will be important and consequential on that, on them working effectively. Absolutely right. Can I move on to scope, if I can, because here I think we still have further to travel. There are a whole slew of amendments, not just the 3 or 4 that I have put my name to with my right honourable learned friend from Beaconsfield, but many others from the right honourable lady from Pontefract and Castleford and others trying to address this issue of the scope of powers which ministers will be given. And I think, in fact, that the ministers themselves have accepted the principle. They said that they are sympathetic to the idea of trying to limit the scope of these powers. I think the Minister at the dispatch box said that both he and the Secretary of State feel that they would like to do this if they could. It seemed to be a question of how, not whether or not it was in principle desirable. And in fact, I think he also, when I tempted him with an intervention, he also said that the view from within the ministry is that they want to try and take just enough powers to successfully translate EU laws into British laws and no more. We all accept they must be no less than the minimum required, but he was very, very clear that they only want to take the minimum that is required and no more. The question is not that principle, the principle, if you like, of necessity, of sufficiency. The question is how you then translate that into a legal wording which will allow that principle to be clearly expressed. And I would gently, but I hope forcefully, say to ministers that as it stands at the moment, I don't think that the words that they have got in this bill is passing the sniff test for an awful lot of us in this room. And I'm extremely pleased, therefore, to see the open and positive and constructive way that ministers have been approaching this issue, and the commitment from the dispatch box this afternoon to go back and have a further look at it. I couldn't tempt the minister into a firm promise to introduce an amendment, but I think that is going to be what is going to be necessary by the time we get to a report, if it is going to be amended in a way which does become acceptable and passes the sniff test for most of us here. And the very fact that the minister was saying, look, I think if I paraphrase him, he said that ministers accept the principle that the minimum necessary, the necessity test, in principle, is the right one. But they just can't find the right words, because if they use the words necessary, then if they have multiple necessities, then the courts will interpret it that in a way which is unhelpful and does not deliver what everybody wants. The problem which ministers have is that the word that they have chosen instead of that is too broad and brings in all sorts of other potential possibilities, which certainly is giving a great deal of concern around the House about whether or not they will be unintentionally, but in fact, in practice, bringing in other powers that they themselves, I think, have said this afternoon they do not desire and that they do not need or want to give themselves at all in principle. And so therefore I would say to them that, again, having discussed this with my right honourable and learned friend from Beaconsfield, actually before I go on, I think I'm being gestured at by my right honourable friend from West Dorset.
Very grateful to my honourable friend once again for giving way. Is he sure that the source of the problem lies in the term appropriate? The more I've listened to the debate this afternoon, it has increasingly seemed to me that maybe the problem arises from the word arising, and perhaps we need a word more like entailed by, that would perhaps limit the scope of appropriateness.
Mr. Chairman, I think what my right honourable friend has just demonstrated is the point I was just about to come on to, which is that we are going to need different words, perhaps in the plural, than what we've got at the moment, and that work and those discussions, which have been promised from the dispatch box, even if an amendment hasn't yet been promised, will be absolutely essential in order to get this right, because it isn't right at the moment. But what is also clear, because in the course of this debate this afternoon we've had 3 or 4 different options already proposed from the backbenches, one from my right honourable learned friend from Beaconsfield, one from my right honourable friend from West Dorset just now, and a couple of others as well, that there is no shortage of possible solutions to this, and that I don't think it's going to be acceptable for ministers to turn around and say, this is a problem which is too hard, so we're going to stick with what we've got. There are enough brains in the room, Mr. Chairman, for us to get this right, and there are certainly enough brains, I'm sure, on the ministerial benches and also amongst their advisers as well. So it ain't going to be good enough for us to turn around and say, we understand the principle, we have in fact already accepted the principle in our remarks today, but it's all too hard and we can't possibly manage it. That won't fly, Mr. Chairman. And therefore, having spoken to and discussed this response with my right honourable learned friend from Beaconsfield, I think that we are content at the moment, based on what we've heard, not to press the amendments on scope that I have co-signed with him here this evening. However, it will be essential, before we get to the report stage, to see some sort of creative alternatives which do solve these problems, which have been alluded to on all sides of the House. There are lots of possible solutions here which other people on both sides of the House can propose. We need to find some that works, and we need to make sure that ministers are content to introduce those in the impressively constructive tone which they have already addressed the issue of the sifting committee, and that needs to be done, I would argue, before report stage arises.
Deirdre Brock.